Welcome to Twisted Roots, a place where stories of family are told not with headlines, but with heartbeats. If you've ever carried memories heavier than your own hands, if you've ever wondered what becomes of love when time tests it, you'll feel at home here. I invite you to stay, to listen, and to subscribe because every story we tell here reminds us of who we are and who we become when the people we love hurt us the most. They say a house is just wood and nails, but to me, this old wooden house has always been more than that. It is the story of my life, written not on paper, but in walls and floorboards. I built it with my hands, one plank at a time. I still remember the day I first drove the shovel into the ground, my palms blistered, my back aching, yet my heart racing with hope. I was a young man then, with a young wife who believed in me, and children I dreamed of raising under a roof I could call our own. Porch, crooked and worn now, was once my proudest accomplishment. I hammered each board while my little girl, barely 5 years old, danced in the yard and sang to me in a voice as light as the summer breeze. The railings still carry the scratches from when my boys raced their toy trucks across them, pretending the world was theirs to conquer. Step inside and the house greets you with memories. The living room, its paint chipped, its ceiling sagging, once echoed with laughter, every Christmas. We huddled around a tree too small for the corner, but too big for our hearts to contain. Every Thanksgiving, the smell of roasted turkey spilled into the walls, clinging to them the way love clings to the soul. The kitchen, oh, the kitchen was my wife's kingdom. She stood at that stove as if it were an altar, stirring soups and stews that warmed more than our stomachs. They warmed our spirits. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can almost hear her humming a hymn as she wiped her hands on her apron, the sound blending with the clatter of pots and pans. The bedrooms tell their own stories. The smallest one still carries a faint ring on the wall where a poster once hung, my son's dream of being a ball player. The largest bedroom, mine and hers, holds silence now, a silence that weighs heavier than words. Since she passed, I sleep alone, but I keep her photograph on the nightstand. I speak to it some nights, foolish maybe, but it's the only way I know to keep her near. Even the flaws of this house are precious to me. The squeak in the third step of the staircase, I could fix it, but I never will. That sound once meant my children were sneaking down for midnight snacks, tiptoeing, giggling, trying not to wake their mother. The crack in the living room wall, it appeared during a storm we thought would rip the roof off, but instead it held us together tighter than ever. People outside might see only an aging house, paint peeling, shutters loose, grass grown too wild. They might say it should be torn down or sold off for something newer. But to me, this house is sacred. It is not a pile of wood. It is not a number on a deed. It is my wife's smile, my children's laughter, my life's work, my heart made visible. I've always believed, perhaps too stubbornly, that this house would be where my family would return year after year, that every holiday, every birthday, every small victory in their lives would lead them back through that front door. Yes, I believed that with all my soul, but belief, I've learned, can be a dangerous thing. They say every man leaves behind fingerprints on the world. Mine are carved into wood. I was never a scholar, never a man of great wealth. What I had were these two hands, scarred, cracked, and weathered by years of labor. Carpentry was my trade, though at times it felt more like my calling. Wood was honest with me. It never pretended to be something it was not, and I, in return, gave it every ounce of strength I had. Each dawn I rose before the sun. The town still slept when I lit the lantern in my workshop. The smell of sawdust was the first breath of my day, the sound of the saw cutting through oak and pine the rhythm of my heartbeat. I built tables that families feasted on, cradles that rocked newborns to sleep, coffins that carried loved ones to their rest. Life, in all its chapters, passed through my shop, and in each piece I tried to put not just skill, but love. But my finest creations were not made of oak or maple. They were my children. Every blister, every aching muscle was a line of credit I paid to the future they deserved. When my hands bled from splinters, I thought of school books. When my back screamed from bending over planks too heavy for one man, I thought of tuition bills. Every nail I drove into a board, I imagined as a stepping stone for them, to rise higher than I ever could. There were days when I came home with pockets nearly empty, yet I carried bread in one hand and hope in the other. My wife would press my shoulders, whispering, "We'll make it through." And somehow we always did. We never had riches, but my children never went to bed hungry. That was the only kind of wealth I cared for. You know what it means to watch your children's shoes wear thin while yours are already torn apart and still choose to buy theirs first. That was my life. Their needs above mine, always. I patched my work clothes until the patches had patches, but I never let them see me as poor. I wanted them to see me as strong, steady, a man who could carry the world if it meant they would never feel its weight. Sometimes I wonder if they ever noticed my hands. The calluses so thick they felt like armor, the deep cracks that no cream could heal. These hands were rough, yes, but everything soft in their lives came from them, warm meals. Paid tuitions, the roof over their heads. I worked and I sacrificed and I told myself, one day they will understand. One day they will look back and see what these hands gave them. I believed that. Just as I believed in the house, in family, in love lasting longer than struggle. But belief, as I said before, can be a dangerous thing. If you ask me what happiness looked like, I would tell you to step back into those winters long ago. Every Thanksgiving, our little wooden house would glow brighter than the finest mansion. The table was never grand, just when I had built myself, its legs uneven, its surface nicked and scarred from years of use. But when my wife laid out the turkey, the mashed potatoes, the pies baked from recipes passed down through her family, that table became a feast fit for kings. The children would argue playfully over who got the drumstick, their laughter bouncing off the walls like music. I remember my youngest slipping scraps under the table to the old dog, and my wife pretending not to notice, her smile giving her away. Outside, the November wind howled, but inside, the house held warmth thick enough to make you forget the world's chill. And then came Christmas. Oh, Christmas in that house was magic. The tree was always too big for the corner. And the ornaments never matched. Half of them were made by the children, paper angels, lopsided stars, strings of popcorn that sagged with time. But to me, that tree outshone any in the department stores downtown. Beneath it, presents wrapped in cheap paper sat waiting, though none of them cost much. Still, the children's eyes lit up as though we had given them the world. I can still hear their voices, shrieks of joy as wrapping paper flew, the sound of toys being tested. The off-key carols sung by a family that didn't care how we sounded, only that we sang together. My wife would sit in her chair, a cup of cocoa in hand, watching us all as if she were keeping a secret, like she knew that these were the moments we would carry long after the ribbons and bows were gone. And I believed those gatherings would be forever. I believed that no matter how far they went in life, my children would always find their way back to that house on the holidays. That one day they would bring their own children, and my grandchildren would run through the same halls, play under the same tree, and feel the same love. That was the dream. That was the promise I carried in my heart. But dreams, I would later learn, do not always survive reality. And promises can be broken, even by the ones you love the most. There is no silence in this world quite like the silence left behind by the one you love. When my wife passed, the house changed. Not in the way of walls or windows, but in its very soul. The laughter faded, the footsteps ceased, and what remained was an echo I couldn't escape. Every room carried her absence, and yet somehow she was everywhere. I kept her chair in the kitchen exactly where it had always been, though no one sat in it anymore. The apron she wore still hung behind the pantry door, a faint trace of her perfume clinging stubbornly to the fabric. At night, I'd find myself reaching for her side of the bed, my hand brushing against cold sheets, the emptiness as sharp as any blade. And yet I couldn't leave this house. I wouldn't, because here she still lived. The kitchen held the sound of her humming. The garden carried the roses she planted, blooming year after year as if her hands still tended them. Even the old rocking chair on the porch remembered the nights she sat there, waiting for me to come home from the workshop. I began to talk to her photograph, the one on the nightstand. Good morning, I would say at dawn, and good night before closing my eyes. I knew the picture couldn't answer back, but sometimes in the quiet of those hours, I almost believed she did. Loneliness, you see, is a strange companion. It sits with you at the table. It follows you down the hall. It breathes in the empty spaces of a house once full. But the memories kept me alive. They were painful, yes, but they were also a kind of mercy. They reminded me that I had loved and been loved, that this old house was not just mine, it was hers too. I thought often of what she told me once in the final days when her hands grew too weak to knead the dough or fold the laundry. She whispered, "Promise me you'll keep the house. Promise me you'll never let it go. As long as it stands, I'll always be here with you." And so I promised. The house became my anchor, my refuge, my last link to the woman who had been my heart for a lifetime. Every creak of the floor, every sway of the porch swing, every flicker of the candle light at night, they were her reminders, small and holy. Yes, I was alone, but as long as I had this house, I believed I still had her. What I did not know, what I could never imagine, was that one day my own children would try to take even this from me. Children don't stay children forever. I knew that. Every parent knows that. Still, knowing doesn't soften the sting when the house grows quiet. One by one they left, first for college, then for jobs, then for families of their own. And I was proud, oh how proud I was. I had worked these hands raw so that they might walk into a brighter world than the one I had known. When I watched them put on their gowns at graduation, when I saw them step into careers and buy their first cars, my heart swelled. I told myself this is what it was all for. Every splinter, every sleepless night in the workshop, every sacrifice, this is the harvest. But pride has a shadow, and that shadow is loneliness. The house that once shook with laughter now waited in silence. Thanksgiving came, but sometimes only one of them could make it home, sometimes none at all. Christmas mornings became phone calls. Sorry, Dad. The kids are sick, or we're spending it with her family this year, maybe next time. The table I had built with my own hands sat half empty. I would set out the extra plates anyway, foolishly, as if the very act might summon them back. The smell of roasted turkey no longer filled the rooms. Sometimes I didn't even bother cooking. I told myself it was just a passing season, that next year they would come, that one day we would all gather again like before. I learned to cling to the smallest moments, a surprise visit on a Sunday afternoon, a grandchild tugging at my sleeve, asking me to carve them a toy from a block of wood. Even a hurried phone call, 5 minutes stolen between their busy lives, was enough to light up my week. Yet no matter how far they drifted, I never let the hope die. I believed they would return, not just for a day, not just for an hour, but truly return, bringing back the laughter, the warmth. The feeling that the house was alive again. I suppose that's what fathers do. We believe even when the world tells us not to. We wait even when the waiting hurts. And I waited, believing year after year that one holiday, one season, the front door would burst open and I'd see them all there again together under the same roof that raised them. But deep down, though I would not admit it, I felt the shift. The phone calls grew shorter, the visits fewer. The house heavier with silence, and I began to wonder if perhaps the memories meant more to me than they ever would to them. Still, I held on to the dream. Because to me, family was not something you outgrow. It was the one thing that should never fade. I did not yet know how cruelly that belief would be tested. For years, I told myself distance was natural, that children grow busy, that life pulls them in directions no parent can control. And so I waited, forgiving the missed holidays, the forgotten birthdays, the hurried phone calls. A father's heart, after all, is trained to understand. But then something changed. Their visits were no longer filled with warmth or stories from their lives. Instead, their eyes wandered around the house, pausing on the photographs, the furniture, the very walls themselves, as though they were measuring, calculating, seeing not memories but value. At first, I brushed it off. I thought perhaps it was only in my head, a trick of an aging man too protective of his past. But soon their words grew sharper, their questions less subtle. How much is the house worth now, Dad? Wouldn't it be easier for you in a retirement place? I laughed nervously, trying to change the subject, but inside a chill settled where once there had only been hope. And then came the day they called for a family meeting. I should have felt joy, finally, all of them under one roof again. But as I set out the chairs, a knot formed in my chest. I didn't know why. Perhaps I did. Perhaps, deep down, I already feared the truth that was waiting at that table. They all came back under my roof that evening. For a moment, as I heard their cars pulling into the driveway, I allowed myself a smile. It felt like the old days, the laughter, the gathering, the warmth I had so longed for. I set out the chairs at the dining table, the same table where we once shared Thanksgiving meals, and I thought, perhaps tonight I will have my family again. But as they sat down, I saw it, the absence of joy in their eyes, the weight of something else entirely. No one asked about my health. No one mentioned the weather, the garden, or the creaky old porch swing. They exchanged glances, uneasy but determined, and I realized this was not a reunion. It was a negotiation. My eldest cleared his throat. Dad, we've been talking the house. Well, it's old. It needs a lot of work, too much for you alone. Another added quickly, and you shouldn't be living here all by yourself. It's not safe. You'd be better off in a place where you can be cared for properly. Their words were dressed in concern, but the seams showed. I could hear what lay beneath: calculation, convenience, inheritance. I folded my hands on the table, the calluses pressing into one another, and waited. I had spent a lifetime listening before speaking. Then the truth came, blunt and cold. If we sell the house, Dad, it'll be enough to split among us, and you won't have to worry anymore. The retirement home has great facilities. You'll be comfortable there. Sell the house. The words slammed into me harder than any hammer I had ever held. They didn't see the house as I did, not as the place where their mother's laughter still lingered in the walls, not as the soil where memories had taken root. To them it was numbers, dollars, equity waiting to be divided. I tried to steady my voice. This is your mother's home, our home. It's not just wood and nails. But they avoided my eyes. Papers appeared on the table. Contracts, evaluations, the ink already dry in places I hadn't touched. My youngest, the one who once slipped scraps under the table to feed the dog, whispered softly as though mercy could be found in tone, "Dad, it's for the best, you'll see." I nodded, though my throat burned. I looked at their faces, faces I had raised, fed, carried through sickness and hardship, and I searched for even a flicker of the children I once knew. But all I saw were strangers speaking in terms of profit, strangers who had forgotten the warmth of Thanksgiving tables, the glow of Christmas trees, the vows whispered by their mother in her final days. And in that moment, I felt the loneliest I had ever been, even with every seat at the table full. It was my second son who said it, not in anger, not even with cruelty in his tone. No, his voice was calm, almost practical, like he was suggesting what to eat for dinner. "Dad, you're old now. The nursing home will be better for you." Just like that. The words fell across the table, but to me they struck like a blade straight into my chest. I had braced myself for disappointment, for arguments, even for pressure. But I was not prepared for the sheer coldness of it. Better for me, that's what they called it. I stared at him, this son of mine, whose hand I once held as we crossed the street, whose broken toys I once mended late into the night, whose tears I once wiped away when the world felt too heavy for his small shoulders. And now, from those same lips came the sentence that cut me deeper than anything life had ever dealt me. The room blurred, my throat closed. My heart thudded in my ears. I opened my mouth to speak, to plead, to remind them of promises, of memories, of the love that once bound us, but nothing came, not a word, only silence. I think they mistook that silence for agreement. They slid the papers closer, a pen laid neatly on top, as if this were nothing more than a transaction. My eldest son pushed gently. "It's for the best, Dad. You'll have company, meals, people to look after you. Isn't that better than rattling around this old house alone?" Alone, yes, I was alone, but I had chosen that aloneness. I had lived with it, carried it, made peace with it, because this house was not empty to me. It still held her. It still held us. To strip it away was not mercy, it was exile. My hands shook under the table. I clenched them into fists, the old scars and calluses pressing into my palms. Still, I said nothing. Because how do you argue with your own blood when they no longer see you as a father, but as a burden? How do you fight against the children you raised when their minds are already made up, their hearts already elsewhere? So I sat there mute, the air heavy with betrayal, while their words circled me like knives, soft voices, reasonable tones, yet cutting me open all the same. And in that silence, I realized something bitter and final. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't carved by enemies, but by the ones you once believed would protect you to the very end. They slid the documents across the table as if it were nothing, just paper, just ink, but to me it felt heavier than stone, as though the weight of generations rested on those pages. The bold letters at the top spelled out what my heart already knew: sale agreement. I stared at it. The numbers, the signatures already scribbled in neat lines by hands that weren't mine, my children's hands, their futures neatly mapped out in black and white, as though this house, my house, her house, were nothing more than a commodity to be traded. One of them tapped the pen against the table, impatient. "Dad, it's simple, just sign here. Once it's done, you won't have to worry anymore." Won't have to worry, that's what they called it, but I wasn't worried, not about myself. I was grieving for a life built brick by brick, memory by memory, grieving for the echo of my wife's laughter still floating down the hallway, grieving for the warmth of holidays, the tiny footsteps that once pitter-pattered across these floors. And now all of it was reduced to a line at the bottom of a contract. My hand trembled as I picked up the pen. It felt alien, heavier than any hammer I had ever held. My vision blurred, not from age, but from tears that burned and refused to fall. I wanted to speak, to say this is wrong. This house is not mine alone. It belongs to every memory we ever made. But the words tangled in my throat. Choked by a sorrow too large to name, across the table my children exchanged glances. One side, another checked their watch. They did not see my trembling. They did not see the storm inside me, or maybe they saw it and chose to look away. The paper waited, the pen hovered, and I, a man who had built his life on decisions, on steady hands and strong choices, found myself paralyzed. I thought of her, my wife, standing in the kitchen, flour dusting her hair, humming softly as she baked bread. I thought of the night we first walked into this house, young and broke, but full of dreams. I thought of every nail I had driven, every wall I had painted, every tear and laugh that had seeped into these wooden beams. Could I sign it away? My hand shook harder. The pen scratched the paper, but no ink flowed. I pulled back, clutching it tight, my knuckles white. I lifted my eyes to theirs, my children. My blood, and whispered so softly, I'm not sure they even heard me. You don't understand, this house is all I have left. But they pressed closer. The contract slid toward me again. The pressure mounted, and I sat there, caught between love and betrayal, between memory and surrender, an old man staring at the ruthless papers that threatened to erase his very life. The room had gone silent, not the kind of silence that soothes, but the heavy kind, the kind that presses down on your chest until breathing feels like a burden. The contract sat in front of me, its black letters staring back like a cruel verdict. The pen trembled in my hand, a fragile reed caught in a storm. I could feel their eyes on me, my children, my flesh and blood, watching, waiting, pressing without a word. I wanted to shout, to slam my fist on the table and cry out, no, this is my home. This is where your mother's soul still lingers, where your childhood lives and breathes in the walls. But no words came, only silence. And silence, in moments like this, is its own kind of surrender. My vision blurred as tears pooled, spilling down the creases of a face weathered by years of sacrifice. Each tear felt like a confession of weakness, of love misplaced, of hope betrayed. My hand, heavy and unsteady, lowered the pen to the page. The scratching sound of ink against paper echoed like thunder in my ears. One letter, then another, my name carved into betrayal. When it was done, the pen slipped from my hand and rolled across the table, its clatter sharp in the suffocating quiet. No one cheered, no one hugged me, no one said thank you. Instead, they gathered the papers quickly, businesslike, sliding them into folders as though sweeping away the evidence of their own cruelty. I wiped my eyes, but the tears would not stop. They fell freely, staining the table, blurring the world before me. I looked around the room at the same faces I had once tucked into bed, once cheered for at graduations, once prayed for through sleepless nights. Faces that now looked like strangers. And in that moment I felt something break inside me, not my body, not even my pride, but something deeper, something that once held us together as a family. I had built this home with my hands, but I had built this family with my heart, and both, in one quiet, merciless stroke of ink, had been taken from me. The silence lingered, the air grew colder, and all I could do was sit there, an old man with trembling hands and tear-streaked cheeks, staring at the signature that had sealed my exile. The door shut softly behind them. Their voices, their footsteps, their hurried conversations about banks and buyers faded into the distance until all that remained was silence. And then, for the first time in my life, I felt like a guest in my own home. I sat at the dining table, the ink of my signature still wet on the cruel papers that lay folded in my eldest son's briefcase. The chair across from me, the one where my wife once sat, her hand resting on mine as we planned tomorrow's meals, tomorrow's life, was empty, so very empty. The house creaked as it always had, the wood shifting, the pipes humming faintly. Once those sounds were comforting, like the house whispering back to me, reminding me I wasn't truly alone, but now they echoed too loudly, like the hollow moans of a body stripped of its soul. I looked around, the framed photographs on the walls, weddings, birthdays. Christmas mornings stared down at me, their frozen smiles mocking the silence. The sofa sagged where countless nights of storytelling and laughter had once pressed into its cushions. The clock ticked on, indifferent, as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. For years I had lived with solitude, yes, but solitude laced with memory, with ownership, with belonging. Tonight that solitude curdled into exile. I was no longer the keeper of this place. I was an intruder, waiting to be escorted out. I rose slowly, my knees aching, and walked through each room. My fingertips trailed along the worn banister, the chipped door frames, the wallpaper that had faded under decades of sunlight. Each touch was a farewell I hadn't been prepared to give. In the living room, I stopped before the old armchair where I had once held my newborn children, rocking them to sleep as storms raged outside. I lowered myself into it now, and for a moment I closed my eyes, willing the weight of a small child against my chest, the warmth of their tiny breath against my neck, but all I felt was emptiness. The pen I had used still lay on the table. I picked it up, rolling it between my fingers. That pen had ended more than a contract. It had ended a life I had built, brick by brick, moment by moment. And so I sat there in the house I had raised, in the family I had given everything for, utterly alone. The silence pressed in from all sides, suffocating, merciless. It was in that silence I finally understood. The room was no longer mine. The house was no longer mine. And soon, even my solitude would be stripped away. Morning came too quickly. Sunlight poured through the curtains in long golden streaks, touching the wooden floors I had polished 100 times with my own hands. The air smelled of dust and memory. My children arrived early, their voices brisk, practical, talking about movers, contracts, and schedules. But I heard none of it. My ears only caught the creak of the floorboards as I walked through the house one last time. Every corner felt like a photograph etched into my soul. The kitchen table where my wife once set down steaming plates of stew. The narrow hallway lined with pencil marks measuring the children's heights year after year. The bedroom closet where her dresses still hung, carrying the faintest trace of her perfume. And then the front door. I stopped at the threshold, my hand resting on the old wooden frame. The grain was worn smooth where countless palms, hers, mine, and the children's, had pressed over the decades. I closed my eyes. And for a moment I could almost feel her there beside me, slipping her arm through mine the way she used to, whispering softly, "Home as long as we're together." But she was gone, and soon the home would be gone too. My hand trembled as I traced the wood, fingertips lingering on every groove, every scar. I pressed my forehead against it like one might against the gravestone of a loved one. My chest heaved, and though I tried to hold them back, the tears came freely, dripping down onto the door like rain. I whispered to the house, as foolish as it may sound, "Thank you for holding us, for keeping her close, for giving me a place to belong." Behind me I heard the cough of impatience. One of my sons called out, "Dad, it's time." I nodded without turning, afraid that if I looked back at them the anger and disappointment would harden inside me. Instead, I kept my eyes on the door, on the memory of the woman who had made this house a home. And then, with a final, trembling breath, I stepped away, out onto the porch, out into a world where the past was no longer mine to hold, out of the only place on earth where I had ever truly belonged. The door shut softly behind me, but to me it sounded like a coffin closing. The car ride was silent, not the peaceful kind of silence I used to treasure on quiet evenings, but a silence so sharp it cut through me. My children sat in the front, speaking in clipped tones about paperwork, costs, and arrangements, as if I weren't even there. I sat in the back seat, my hands folded tightly over my knees, staring out the window as the house, my house, faded into the distance. Each block we drove felt like another nail sealing me away from the life I had built. I wanted to ask them to turn around, to give me just one more night in my chair by the fireplace, one more morning with the sun streaming across the kitchen table. But the words caught in my throat, and I swallowed them like bitter stones. At last the car slowed. Ahead stood tall gates of iron, painted a pale white that somehow felt more like a shroud than a welcome. Above them, the sign read, "Evergreen Senior Living." The letters were cheerful, meant to comfort. To me they looked like a sentence carved into stone. The gates creaked open, slow and deliberate, like jaws widening to swallow me whole. When we pulled in, a nurse in a tidy uniform greeted us with a practiced smile. "Welcome, mister," she said, her voice polite, rehearsed, distant. I nodded, unable to reply. Behind me, the trunk clicked open. My son lifted out the single suitcase they had packed for me, neatly folded shirts, slippers, a photo frame they thought might make me feel at home. It looked so small, so pitiful, compared to the lifetime I was leaving behind. I stepped out of the car, my knees weak, the ground beneath my shoes feeling foreign. The air smelled of antiseptic and freshly mowed grass, not of pinewood floors, not of my wife's cooking, not of the home that had shaped me. The nurse led me down the walkway, clipboard in hand, while my children lingered by the car. I glanced back, half expecting one of them to walk beside me, to place a hand on my shoulder, to say, "We'll visit tomorrow, Dad," but they didn't. They only exchanged a few words with the staff, shook hands, and prepared to leave. The iron gates closed behind them with a metallic clang. I flinched at the sound. It was final, unyielding, like prison doors locking shut. I was now, as they called it, a new resident, but in truth, I felt less like a resident and more like an exile. A man stripped from his land, his memories, his dignity, and deposited in a place that smelled of endings. As I was led inside, I turned back one last time. Through the gates, I saw my children get into the car. The engine roared to life. They didn't wave, they didn't look back, and as the vehicle rolled away, carrying with it the last ties to the family I had once sacrificed everything for, I whispered to myself, too softly for anyone to hear, "So this is what it means to be forgotten." They led me to my room. A nurse with kind eyes but hurried steps opened the door, flicked on the light, and said, "Here we are, mister," as though I had just checked into a hotel. Then she handed me a small pamphlet about activities and meal times, smiled politely, and left me standing there with my suitcase. The door clicked shut, and I was alone. The room was clean, I will admit that, too clean. The walls were painted a sterile white, not a single mark. Not a single memory clinging to them. The bedspread was a pale blue, tucked tight, smelling faintly of bleach. On the nightstand sat a lamp identical to every other lamp in every other room on this floor. I sat on the bed, its mattress too stiff, and ran my hand over the cold metal rail at its side. My fingers curled instinctively. Searching for the familiar grooves of the wooden headboard I had once carved myself back home, the one my wife used to lean against as she read in bed at night, but of course it wasn't there. I turned to the walls, desperate for something to hold on to. Back at my house, every wall had a story. The living room wall with the crack shaped like a lightning bolt, the one my children used to trace with their fingers as though it were a secret treasure map. The faded paint near the kitchen doorway, stained from years of holiday cooking. Even the nails that once held our family portraits, leaving behind tiny scars, felt like sacred marks of time. Here there was nothing, just white emptiness staring back at me, erasing me. I unpacked slowly, placing the framed photograph of my wife on the nightstand. Her smile looked even lonelier against the blank backdrop. I whispered to her, as I often did, "It's not home, love. But I need you with me wherever I go." The days began to settle into a rhythm, though not the kind that comforts. Breakfast at 8, lunch at noon, dinner at 6, a knock on the door for medication, a reminder for exercise class I never attended. Other residents shuffled by in the hallway, some in wheelchairs, some muttering to themselves. We all shared the same title, residents, but none of us truly belonged here. At night, the silence grew heavier. I would lie awake listening to the faint hum of fluorescent lights, wishing instead for the creak of my wooden floors, the tick of my old clock, the muffled laughter of children down the hallway. Loneliness is louder in a place like this. I tried to tell myself I could adapt, that perhaps in time this could feel like a kind of home. But deep down I knew the truth. A home is not a building. It is the collection of lives lived within its walls, and without that, all I had here were walls too white, too empty, too hollow to hold the weight of a lifetime. And so I sat there night after night, staring at those blank walls, searching for cracks, stains, anything to remind me of life, but there was nothing. Only my reflection, faintly caught in the sterile glass of the window, whispering back the same thought over and over again. I don't belong here, I never will. There wasn't much I was allowed to bring with me. A few shirts, a pair of slippers, some toiletries. My children said, "Dad, you won't need much. They'll provide everything there." Everything, how little that word meant. In the end, I chose to pack only one thing that truly mattered, a small photograph of my wife. It wasn't even framed in anything fancy, just a simple wooden frame I had carved decades ago in my workshop. The corners were rough, uneven. But she loved it because my hands had made it. The photo inside was beginning to fade, the edges curling from years of being touched, kissed, carried. But her smile, oh, her smile was as vivid as the day it was taken. I placed it on the nightstand beside my bed in the nursing home. The sterile white walls, the metal furniture, the stiff mattress, none of it belonged to me. But that photograph, that was mine, that was her. Every night before I closed my eyes, I would reach out and let my fingers rest against the glass. It was cold, of course, never warm like her cheek once was, but if I closed my eyes tight enough, I could almost pretend. I would whisper to her, soft and trembling, "Good night, love. Don't let me forget you. Please don't let me forget." Some mornings, when the first light spilled through the blinds, I would wake to find my hand still resting on the frame, as though my body refused to let go even in sleep. The nurses noticed. One of them once asked gently, "Is that your wife?" I nodded. My throat ached too much for words. She smiled politely and moved on, but she didn't understand. None of them did. That photograph was not just a picture. It was the last breath of warmth I had left. It was the echo of every holiday meal, every bedtime story, every kiss at the doorway before I went to work. It was proof that once I had been loved completely. Now, in this place of routines and silence, it was all I had to remind me that love was real, that my life had not just been measured in years, but in moments, moments that still lived in her smile. And so, night after night, I clung to that small piece of her, not because it was enough, but because it was all I had left. When I first arrived here, I told myself it was only temporary. "That's what children do," I whispered. "They just need time to settle things, then they'll come." The first week I sat by the window each morning, combing my thinning hair, adjusting my shirt, making sure I looked presentable. I imagined the sound of footsteps in the hallway, a familiar laugh echoing outside my door. I pictured my children walking in, carrying coffee, maybe pastries from the bakery I loved, saying, "Dad, we just wanted to check in." But the hallway remained silent. Only the nurse's shoes clicking briskly across the linoleum reminded me that the world still moved. The second week, I lingered in the common room during visiting hours. I watched other residents' families arrive, daughters with bouquets of flowers, grandchildren tugging at their coats, sons who pretended not to wipe their eyes as they hugged their fathers. I told myself, maybe today. Maybe my family will walk through those doors too. But they didn't, not once. By the third week, I stopped sitting by the window. The waiting had worn me down. My shirt stayed wrinkled, my hair uncombed. What was the use of preparing for guests who never came? The truth began to settle in me like a heavy stone. I was not a father waiting to be visited. I was a man they had placed somewhere convenient, like a box stored in an attic, out of sight, out of mind. Sometimes at night, when the halls grew quiet and the hum of fluorescent lights was the only sound left, I would speak softly to the photograph of my wife. "They'll come, won't they? Maybe next Sunday, maybe on my birthday." But even as I said it, my voice trembled because I knew the answer. The phone never rang. No footsteps came down that hallway for me. And so the days bled together, breakfast, lunch, dinner, sleep, each one as hollow as the last. I was surrounded by people, yet lonelier than I had ever been. Loneliness is not the absence of company. It is the absence of those you gave your life to, and every passing day made it clearer. My children weren't coming back, not to the house, not to me, not even here. The nights were always the hardest. The halls would fall silent after dinner, the televisions in the common room shut off, the footsteps of nurses fading into distant echoes. That was when the loneliness pressed down hardest, when the walls of this sterile room seemed to close in. I would reach for the photograph of my wife, lift it gently and whisper, "I miss you," I would say, as though she could hear me through the glass. "You remember the Thanksgiving dinners? The children running wild in the yard? You remember the way the house smelled of cinnamon and pine at Christmas? I thought those days would never leave us. I thought the house would keep us together forever." Sometimes my whispers grew into stories, long and winding. I told her about the oak tree I had planted in the front yard the year we married, about the evenings we sat on the porch, listening to the cicadas, holding hands in the quiet. I told her how the house still carried her presence, her laughter, her touch, even her perfume in the old bedroom curtains. One night, as I was speaking to her photo, I heard a voice from the doorway. "Sir, who are you talking to?" I looked up, startled. A young man stood there holding a clipboard against his chest. He was one of the newer staff, barely in his 20s, with soft brown hair that fell into his eyes. He looked embarrassed, as though he had intruded. I cleared my throat. "My wife," I said quietly, lifting the frame. "She passed years ago, but she's still here with me." He stepped inside, slowly, as though approaching a fragile thing. "She's beautiful," he said, glancing at the photo. His voice carried no judgment, only gentleness. I surprised myself by smiling faintly. She was my whole world, and so was the house we built together. Every board, every brick, every nail, I thought it would always be ours. A place where the children would bring their families back, where holidays would go on forever. But now, my voice broke. I set the photo back down, my hand trembling. The boy pulled up a chair without asking. He sat, leaning forward, listening as though my words mattered. "Tell me about it," he said softly. "Tell me about your home." And so I did. For the first time since arriving here, I spoke freely. I told him about the creak of the floorboards in winter, about the crack in the living room wall that my children used to trace with their fingers, about the porch swing where my wife once fell asleep in the summer heat. My voice shook, but he never looked away. Hours must have passed. When I finally fell silent, he nodded slowly, as if memorizing every detail. "That sounds like more than a house," he said. "That sounds like love." I felt a lump rise in my throat. No one had said words like that to me in so long. That night when he left the room, I realized something I hadn't felt in weeks. I was not invisible. Someone had heard me. Someone cared enough to listen. And though the loneliness still clung to me, it no longer felt queasy. That night I could no longer hold my words inside. The silence of the room pressed too heavily against my chest, and when I looked at her photograph, my composure crumbled. The young staff member was there again, sitting quietly on the edge of the chair he had dragged into my room the night before. He didn't rush me, didn't prod me. He just sat, present, patient, and so I spoke. "My son," I began, my voice breaking. "All I ever wanted was to stay in the home your mother and I built, to sit on that old porch where she used to rock in the swing, to hear the wind through the same crooked shutters, to smell the pine boards after the rain. That house wasn't just wood and brick, it was her, it was us." My chest trembled and the tears finally came hot and unstoppable. "I don't need money, I don't need comfort, I don't need this place." I gestured at the bland white walls. "The lifeless furniture. All I need is to sit in that chair by the window where she once sewed, to run my hand over the railing I sanded with these calloused hands. That's all I ever asked." My voice rose in desperation, echoing in the small room. I gave my life to them, to those children. Every nail I hammered, every meal I skipped so they could eat, it was for them. And now they've taken from me the only thing I had left, my home, her memory, our life. I covered my face with both hands, the sobs shuddering through me until I could barely breathe. "God help me," I whispered, broken. "All I want is to go home." The room was so still, I thought perhaps the boy had left, but when I lowered my hands, I saw him sitting there, his eyes wide, shining not with pity, but with something fiercer, something like outrage mixed with compassion. "I'm so sorry," he said softly, almost choking on the words. "No one should have to beg for the right to keep their memories." He hesitated, then reached for his pocket. I didn't notice at first, but later I realized his phone was recording, quietly, discreetly. He wasn't just listening, he was keeping my words safe. That night when he finally left, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My pillow was damp with tears, but for the first time I felt a strange, flickering hope. My story was no longer trapped within these walls. Someone had heard it, someone cared enough to carry it further. I didn't yet know how far my words would travel. I only knew this: the truth had left my lips, and it was no longer mine alone. I never thought my story would leave the four walls of that room. To me, it was just the lament of an old man talking to a photograph, whispered confessions in the dark. But to the young man who listened, it was something more. That night, after drying his eyes, he left my room with a look I couldn't quite place, half sorrow, half resolve. What I didn't know then was that he carried my words with him, not just in memory, but in the glowing screen of his phone. He sat down in the break room, his hands trembling slightly as he typed. The post was simple, almost too simple for the weight it carried. "I met a man tonight in the nursing home where I work. His children sent him here so they could sell his house, the home he built with his wife, the place where every holiday memory lived. He doesn't want money or comfort or even our care. He just wants to sit on the porch where his wife once rocked, and run his hands across the wood he carved with his own. He cries for home while his children count their profit." He attached no names, no details, only the truth as he had heard it, and then almost on instinct he pressed post. At first there was nothing, just a lonely block of text among millions, but within an hour a comment appeared, then another, then another. By morning the post had been shared hundreds of times, by the next day thousands. People wrote things like, "This broke my heart. How could children do this to their father?" A house is not just property, it's memory, it's love. Someone added, "This could be my dad, this could be me one day." The boy returned to me that evening, his phone buzzing constantly in his pocket. He looked at me as though I was no longer just a man in a forgotten room, but a story the world had claimed. "People are listening," he said softly. "They're angry for you. They're crying for you." I stared at him, not fully understanding. The idea of strangers, people I would never meet, reading my pain, carrying it with them into their own homes, was almost too large to grasp. But something stirred in me, something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't joy, it wasn't revenge, it was recognition. The world at last saw me. The whispers had begun, quiet but relentless, like the first gusts of wind before a storm. And I knew, though I could not yet imagine how, that nothing would remain the same. I never imagined the world would care about an old man's sorrow. Yet overnight my story, our story, became a storm. The young man showed me the screen of his phone one evening, and I could hardly believe what I saw. There were thousands of comments, tens of thousands of shares. My words, those trembling confessions whispered through tears, were no longer mine. They had become a cry carried across the world. Some wrote, "My father worked his whole life for us." Reading this, I called him tonight just to say I love him. How dare they, to trade love for profit, to discard a man who gave them everything. This is unforgivable. Others posted their own stories, photos of fathers in old rocking chairs, grainy holiday pictures from homes long since sold. Strangers were binding their grief with mine, weaving a fabric of shared outrage and sorrow. Then the news outlets picked it up. First a local paper, then a regional channel. And soon even national networks carried the headline. "Elderly father sent to nursing home as children sell family house." They didn't print my name, but they didn't need to. Everyone seemed to know the face behind the story. Every line etched into my skin, every tear I shed into the night, it was all there in their imagination. Meanwhile, my children could no longer hide. People began to connect the dots, the neighborhood, the house, the timelines. Comments started to appear beneath their own social media posts. Words like shame, ungrateful, how could you? One of my daughters called me, her voice trembling not with love but with fear. "Dad, you don't understand what's happening online. People are attacking us. Reporters keep calling. You have to tell them it's not true." I listened, silent. What could I say that it was true? That their own father's tears had been turned into headlines because they left me no other choice but to weep in the dark. She grew angrier, her words sharp. "You're ruining our lives." And in that moment I felt a strange calm. For the first time in years, it was not me who bore the weight of shame, it was them. Out there beyond these sterile walls, people I had never met had taken up my defense. The fire was no longer mine to carry. It burned now in thousands of hearts, demanding justice, demanding decency. And as I sat in that narrow bed, I realized something profound. Though they had taken my house, my children could not silence my story. What began as a whisper in the night had become a roar no one could ignore. I used to think the world outside these walls had forgotten me, that the laughter once shared on my porch had vanished into time, leaving nothing but silence. But now I realized I had never been so wrong. It began with letters. A nurse brought in a bundle one morning, her arms overflowing with envelopes. At first I thought it was a mistake, but when she handed them to me I saw my name, scrawled in different handwritings from places I had never been. Some letters were short, "We stand with you, sir." Others were pages long, pouring out their own stories of betrayal or of children they still prayed would not forget them. Inside one, a woman had slipped a small photo of her father, writing, "I wish I had fought harder for him. I fight now for you." Then came the visits. People I had never met began arriving at the nursing home gates, holding flowers, baked pies, even little hand-carved trinkets. They asked to see me, to sit with me, to tell me I was not alone. The staff, at first hesitant, eventually allowed some through, and when they entered my room, their eyes softened as though they were stepping into a holy place, not because of me, but because of what I represented, every father who had been forgotten. Meanwhile, my children could not escape the storm. Neighbors stopped them at the grocery store, shaking their heads in disapproval. At work, colleagues whispered. At church, pews turned cold. They were not treated with cruelty. No, it was worse than that. They were treated with disappointment, with silence heavy enough to crush. One evening, my son stormed into my room, his face red. "Do you know what you've done?" he hissed. "People spit at me on the street. Our names are ruined, all because you couldn't just stay quiet." I looked at him, and for once I did not lower my eyes. My voice was calm, almost tender. I stayed quiet my whole life for you. For your happiness, for your future. But it wasn't me who broke the silence, it was the truth, and the truth always finds a way. He had no reply. He turned and walked out, slamming the door, but the echo of my words lingered longer than his anger. And so the judgment came not from courts or laws, but from the very fabric of community. The neighbors who once watched them play in my yard, the strangers who knew the sacredness of a father's love. The millions online who refused to let my story fade. For the first time in years, I did not feel invisible. The world had taken notice, and though my house was gone, I realized something greater had been built. A voice carried on the strength of thousands, stronger than any wall or roof could ever be. I never thought strangers could feel like family. Yet here I was, sitting in a narrow chair by the window of the nursing home, watching the door open again and again, each time revealing new faces, unfamiliar yet shining with warmth. At first it was the neighbors. Mrs. Carlson, who used to wave at me from across the street when I mowed the lawn, appeared one Sunday morning with a basket of homemade bread. Her eyes glistened as she pressed it into my hands. "You built that house with your own hands, George," she whispered. "I saw it. I saw the life you gave your children. You deserved better." Then came others, faces I had never seen, people who had only read my story online. A young couple drove 3 hours with their 2 children just to sit with me for half an hour. They brought a pumpkin pie, still warm. The little girl climbed onto my lap without hesitation and called me Grandpa. The word pierced me. Soft and sharp all at once, because my own grandchildren had stopped calling me that long ago. Day after day, the visits continued. Truck drivers passing through town, college students with notebooks in hand, eager to hear my stories. Retired soldiers who clasped my calloused hands and said, "You remind me of my father." Some brought gifts, fruit, blankets, even a handmade wooden cross. But more than things, they brought their presence, their listening, their respect. Meals became something different, too. I no longer sat in silence with the bland food the home provided. Instead, people would bring casseroles, soups, even barbecued ribs, and sit with me at the small table, eating together as though I were seated at the head of a family once again. Laughter filled the room, echoing off the sterile white walls, softening them, reshaping them into something almost like home. The staff began to call me something new, the community's father. And though it startled me at first, I slowly let the title rest upon my shoulders. Because in their eyes I was not simply an old man abandoned by his children. I was a symbol of every father's sacrifice, every parent's love that too often goes unnoticed until it's too late. One evening, as I sat with 3 young men who had driven in from another town, sharing stories over coffee they had smuggled in, one of them said, "Sir, you don't know what you've done. Your pain gave people a mirror. They're calling their parents again. They're visiting them. Because of you, families are talking that haven't spoken in years." I bowed my head. Tears slid down my cheeks, but they weren't only for sorrow anymore. They were for something new, something I thought I'd lost forever, a sense of belonging. My children had taken my house, but these people, these strangers, had built me something greater, not with bricks, not with wood, but with compassion, a shelter made of hearts. And for the first time in a long while, I no longer felt like a man without a home. The day the cameras came, I felt strangely calm. Reporters filled the small nursing home hall, their microphones pushed forward, flashes flickering against my tired face. But I was not there to accuse, nor to fan the flames of anger already surrounding my children. I was there to remind the world of something simpler, something older than wealth, older than property. They asked me what I thought of my children now, what I wanted to say to them. I looked at the lens, knowing they might be watching from wherever they were, and I spoke softly, as if speaking only to my own family. "I forgive you, I always will, but remember this, a house is not just walls and wood, it is the heart of a family. And once the heart is gone, no riches in the world can replace it." The room fell silent. Some reporters lowered their microphones. I could see tears glimmering in the eyes of strangers. In the weeks that followed, invitations poured in talk shows. Interviews, community events, yet I chose a different path. With the support of kind people across the country, I began building something new, a scholarship and charity fund in the name of my late wife. She was the reason I built that house in the first place. She was the one who made it a home, and now, through this fund, her love would live on, helping children in need, giving them the chance my own children had forgotten to value. I may have lost my home, but I found a purpose. I may have been betrayed, but I discovered a greater family, spread across streets and towns I will never see, bound together by compassion. And as I sit here, older and weaker with each passing season, I no longer fear the silence of these walls. For I know that beyond them her name lives, and so does mine, in the kindness we leave behind. Thank you, dear friends, for walking with me through this story. Life often tests the strength of our hearts. But love, true love, never dies. It only changes shape, waiting to be passed on. I wish you health, peace, and a home always filled with warmth. Hold close the ones you love and never forget. Family is not measured in wealth, but in the memories we build together. And if this story touched your heart, I humbly ask, stay with us, subscribe, and share so that these lessons may reach further. Because sometimes one story can keep another family from breaking.